Hello and welcome to the CX Files for 19th September 2024. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan in Montreal, but not much longer, Mark, because in the next 24 hours, I'll be flying to Asia to do some speaking, actually, at the Inspiro Annual Client Advisory Board Summit, which is taking place in the Philippines.
Okay, that's certainly going to be a long flight for you, isn't it?
Yeah, and flights right now in Canada are a little bit uncertain because Air Canada has put itself into a strike position, at least the pilots union has, and there's a great deal of uncertainty how people are going to be flying around. Fortunately, I worked very closely with my travel agent. We were able to suss out some new options, and I'm excited to be heading over on an airline that will not be Air Canada.
Okay, well, you could always take the Amtrak down to New York and then fly from there.
Well, there absolutely is that possibility. I will tell you that one thing is when you learn that there's going to be a disruption to any type of air travel on a particular airline, you get creative and you find different solutions.
Okay. Well, talking of creativity, we have some very creative guests, and we have two guests this week, actually. I talked to Stephen Loynd, our good friend, who has appeared here before, founder of TrendzOwl, and Chris Gillen, the founder of A Closer Look. So both of them are involved in research, analysis, and publishing opinion around customers, customer experience, and how brands need to represent themselves and get closer to customers. But we focused our conversation on artificial intelligence. And what we really wanted to do was have a sort of almost like a reset conversation, because I think, if you look at last year, if you look at 2023, there was a lot of doom and gloom in the industry. There was a lot of talk of AI being a catastrophe for the BPO community. And I remember even the Washington Post talking about, an end to thousands of jobs in places like India and the Philippines, just because of this. But we've seen kind of a reset in 2024. There's been a real exploration of how do we make this tool work? What can it do for us? How can it promote efficiency, productivity? How can it improve services to customers? And so now there's some real use cases for how it's working, and we haven't seen a sort of end to the role of the agent. So it's a much more complex and nuanced conversation. And so I got two guys that really do have a lot of background knowledge on AI to talk about this.
And you couldn't have had two better people in the form of Chris and Steve. As many of the listeners will know, both these individuals have spoken at CX Outsourcers events about this topic. We've also had engagement on this podcast with both Chris and Steve. They are probably two of the smartest people I've ever been in a room with. And from my perspective, I think that this interview is going to shed a lot of light on the complexity of what these technologies can do, the impact on the agent community, the impact on the consumer, but quite frankly, a level set, which is something that we desperately need after 2 years of hype cycle nonsense from so many different quarters.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's been so much nonsense throughout the industry and the business media more generally. And I
Yeah.
think that what's interesting that both Stephen and Chris are talking about is how the industry is changing and responding to the use of AI. And this is permeating every kind of section, both the captive contact centers, but also the BPOs as well. And even down to the level of how do BPOs charge for their services if we're no longer really measuring only agents in a contact center? So there's a lot of big changes, but it's coming slower than we kind of imagined it would last year.
Yeah, but I also think that this is indicative of technology in general. There's always a huge hype cycle that pops up. And then when the rubber starts to hit the road, we see it's not as obvious and it's not as Space 1999 instantly as what many people in the business media. And by the way, I would agree with you about the business media. I think they've been incredibly guilty of really fueling this hype cycle. So in my mind, Mark, what we've got in the form of Steve and Chris is really an opportunity to understand in a pragmatic, realistic form what CX can anticipate from these technologies, from AI, and the extent to which over the near, medium, and long term, we should anticipate changes, what those changes might look like.
Okay, let's go straight to this interview, my conversation with Stephen Loynd and Chris Gillen. Okay, Chris, so why don't we start off with you? Because we're looking at, AI and how it's influenced and changed CX, especially over the past couple of years, because, it was right at the end of 2022 that OpenAI launched ChatGPT, and that seemed to sort of trigger something. Even the public became aware of what's possible, even though companies have been researching this stuff for many years. But the immediate reaction from the media, as we sort of look at it back at it from last year in 2023, was around how many jobs are going to vanish, how CX is entirely changing, and contact centers will close. I even saw the Washington Post talking about this will be a nightmare for India and the Philippines as the entire industry is about to shut down. And it seems that this year there's more of an acceptance that change is possible. There will be innovation. Companies, whether they're using a BPO or whether they're doing this internally, but they're finding ways to use AI to improve CX, create more efficiencies. There's been a sort of reality check this year from the shock and horror of last year. But how do you see that sort of progressing into next year then?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting discussion to have. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about when OpenAI kind of launched chatbot GPT and it hit the market, and the flood of, just speculation and intrigue and, with AI and all that could do. And I was thinking about, there were so many things going around that AI is going to change everything. AI is going to do this. AI is going to do that. And here's my theory on it. I think a lot of people just took that at face value. AI is going to change everything. When the reality of it is, it wasn't AI that was going to change anything. It's how these businesses would adopt and implement AI, whether you're a business or a consumer, that are inherently going to change everything going forward. So I do think, as silly as this might sound, there was a bit of, well, AI is out there, so what is it going to go do? But the reality of it is people have to adopt AI. Consumers have to adopt it. Businesses have to adopt it. And I think herein lies the problem, right? The problem was this hit the market. And I think Stephen's talked about this several times as well, is the rate of acceleration and change is constantly outpacing the rate of adoption. And so even if businesses, and I'm sure we'll get into it, Mark, a whole host of reasons why businesses, I think, are very slow to adopt. But I think in large part, that's simply because they don't know what to do yet, right? Every time, if you think about this, every time something comes out and you're like, oh, that's really cool, and you start to implementing it 2-3 months down the road, it's already outdated. And there's already something bigger and better. And so it's this whole concept, I think, of setting expectations that AI is a tool like anything. It's like the steam engine back in the Industrial Revolution. It's a tool. But really, change is only going to happen when consumers and businesses actually figure out how to adopt it and implement it for the better. That's my take on it.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve. I mean, how do you see this developing into the next couple of years then?
Yeah, I think that building those train tracks is a great metaphor. I mean, what people, to your point, Mark, when the big news happened in late 2022 with OpenAI and ChatGPT, a lot of people assume, oh, this means that everything's going to happen now. But the train tracks are being built in real time. The systems are being reinvented and revolutionized, and it's not a perfect process. It's a widening turn, is the metaphor I use for my new book. But the change is coming, and to Chris's point, it's not just in the contact center, which is fascinating use case for us, the three of us that have been in this industry. which makes this time so exciting. But it's happening in other areas. I mean, if you think of, for example, in telecom, Nokia is working with NVIDIA to bring AI to optimize networks, telecom networks. Intuit is embedding AI in an AI-driven platform to do things with the AI that prior versions would have a human being do. And so the point is that this stuff is embedding itself in some cases gradually, in other cases extremely quickly. There are pullbacks, there are successes, there are predictions. And so we're on this train or this ship trying to get our sea legs, as Chris kind of indicated, trying to figure out in what direction are we headed. And it seems from kind of a big picture standpoint that the competition and the frantic pursuit and the money and the partnerships involved is at such an intense level that we've set out on this journey and there's no going back. And the revolution is in progress, it seems.
Yeah.
So amazing times that we're living in.
Yeah, and I think both of you have mentioned the sort of rate of change there and the difficulty of, balancing what's available with what's being adopted. And this, immediately that was making me think about how management consultants used to work. They'd always kind of draw something saying, this is your business in 3 years, and you'd have the future state, and then you could create a project plan, working backwards, from here to there. Here's what we need to implement. Here's the tech that we need, and then we'll get you there. It feels like that kind of idea doesn't work anymore, And I know that you mentioned your book, Stephen, because that focused on innovation in America and how AI is going to change that. And I guess that what you're talking about is a sort of business environment where we no longer know what's going to happen next year or what tools will be available. So how do you realistically, as a sort of executive, start planning for an environment like that then?
I love that question. I was thinking about this 10 years ago. I was speaking at Frost and Sullivan Mind Exchange events, and one thing I was really excited about was Amazon Alexa. And I would talk about the power of exponential technology and the possibilities of this new tool. Now, on the one hand, you could say, oh, it was a dud, relatively speaking. But then you think, well, let's skip ahead 10 years. What's recently happening? Amazon is partnering with Anthropic, the Claude AI model, to bring new capabilities to Alexa. And so a new marriage is being arranged between Claude and Alexa. So to answer your question, the first thing that comes to me, and I know Chris will have other ideas, is I don't know how much you can plan, but what you can do is keep an eye out for partnerships. The partnerships that are being spawned, the most obvious one is OpenAI and Microsoft, but Amazon and Anthropic is another quick example of new technologies emerge via new companies, and you have to try to figure out how to fit that puzzle in and then iterate forward with your solution in combination with theirs. And so it's this fecund kind of a very fertile environment now where new things are being born when you create new partnerships. So that's my first idea in response to that question about how to prepare, is keep an eye out for a worthy partner, maybe.
Yeah. Well, and I love that, Stephen, because I have a theory, and I think I'm qualified to say this because I had the privilege of spending 35 years of my career with some really well-known companies, and I can go on record and tell you that even in a normal situation, take AI out of it, most companies are not good at strategy, and that's just a fact. Like they get so wrapped up in the day-to-day of the business and the model and all the stuff that they're doing that they don't have time to really do exactly what Stephen is talking about, which is really sitting down and understanding partnerships and connections and how do I pull all this technology together? Where do I implement it? How do I do it? What does that look like? Most companies are just not built for that. And so when you think about whether it's BPOs, whether it's, just traditional direct-to-consumer companies, is that they're just not good at the strategy piece of it. This is why I always am baffled why these companies are not using consultants in this area more than I thought they actually would, that this would be a prime opportunity to bring outside players in to really help them with, connecting the dots and, this idea of contextual learning where you're looking at multiple things and pulling them all together. They're not able to do that. I think that has led to the kind of underwhelming adoption of AI from a lot of these companies. But I say that to say, I think the tide is turning a bit. I think companies are starting to figure some things out. I believe it was Klarna that came out not too long ago and said that some of their AI work specifically on frontline CX, and I'm just quoting off the top of my head, I think it was like 700 agents or something they claim they could get rid of with that technology. So the good news is, although it's been very, very slow, I do think you're going to see more and more companies, especially as we move into 2025, actually starting to connect the dots. And then I think in turn, that will allow other companies to go, well, look what they did. Now let me go see what I can do there. So I just think it's been a lot slower in terms of the rate of adoption because of the acceleration of the technology, the competing priorities that the world is experiencing. It isn't just AI. There's a lot of other things that are happening that's putting downward pressure on these companies. But my prediction is you're going to start to see some more relevant, tangible, actual use cases of AI being deployed to increase CX, take it to a next level, as I like to say, because it needs it right now. I mean, it needs it really, really bad.
And do you think that it is the end consumers that are maybe, sticking some grit in the wheels there then? Is it, a reticence on your average kind of person to release the data or their personal data that would make some of these systems work better and, and really be able to, because we always talk about being able to mine the information and to create a more personalized customer experience. But ultimately, that means that everybody's got to be happy with the system mining your data in the first place.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe Chris first on that, is there like something that's possible, but maybe the people don't actually want to allow it?
Well, it's interesting. We asked ourselves that same question. So we went out and surveyed average consumers, and I think we talked about 1,700 consumers, all age, all demographics, all age groups. And there's already a pretty significant mistrust from the consumer side about AI. And so when we ask them, how often do you think you're interacting with AI? And again, I'm quoting, I think 67% of people said they felt like they've interacted with AI. The interesting thing about that is, I don't know if it was really AI or maybe just intelligent pre-programmed bots or whatever, but the assumption is being made. This is the other thing that I try to help my clients understand, Mark. The assumption is being made now is that they're possibly talking to AI, and there's a mistrust there. They're concerned with giving information, and we all know this. For every 5 positive, honest interactions of AI, somebody's working on 10 dishonest ways to use AI to get your information. So the danger with these businesses right now is they have to be so careful about, especially if they're pushing anything in front of the consumer, how they do that. I always say, build your AI with the end consumer in mind. Don't think about how it's going to reduce your cost yet. I mean, really get it out there, because you could shoot yourself in the foot if you don't implement it correctly, knowing that the consumer's already going into this very leery of AI. And you couple that with what's been happening for the last 10 years with personal information and data. And at least once a week, there's a data breach that's happening somewhere all over the world. And so all of that being pulled together, I think puts even more pressure on the business, that when they do think about how they're going to implement or use AI, they have to keep all that in mind, because if they don't do it correctly, they could actually make their experience worse and lose more customers in the process.
Yeah, and that brings me back to the idea of partnerships, Mark. Just a few days ago, Salesforce announced they're acquiring this company, Own, which it's a data management and data security capabilities that they will integrate into their data cloud, which is, I think the data cloud is making like 400 million in revenue a year for Salesforce. But they know they need to reassure, in this case, salespeople and the users of their systems that it's secure data. And so there again, there's an example of partnerships that are coming together to try to address any challenges that are presenting themselves on the journey of innovation.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and of course, customer service is an area where we're seeing a lot of innovation because of these tools that are becoming available. And yet, if we look at internal customer service centers or the BPOs that provide this service, as an outsourced service, traditionally this is always focused around the contact center, and we even see this with the FTE, the full-time equivalent, has become the sort of standard way of pricing services. So if we know there's about 100 people in the contact center, we can create a price for that service. But it seems that what we're seeing here, and Chris, you mentioned Klarna, because I think Klarna, they said something like about 2/3 of their interactions were immediately automated. So if you say, we can kind of use this tech to automate 2/3 of those interactions, then there's no connection anymore with the number of agents in a contact center and the number of customer interactions. So, how do you cost this? How do the BPOs create a cost model that still continues to work so that they can invest in building their service? And that may well need to include things like the cost of technology, the cost of training language models, so we need a sort of a more sophisticated understanding, don't we, of how this works?
I think, Mark, and I know, and I can't say it openly because I don't think it's been made public yet, but there is a company that's being worked on that wants to, a group of people that want to change the kind of the face of BPO with a new model, which is really more of this, take a page from the SaaS chat vendor or SMS vendor. If you're doing anything with those vendors, they're charging you typically per interaction, per message, per conversation, however you want to think about that, right? And so the thinking, as I've heard in talking to some of these folks that are kind of in the process of skunk working this new concept for BPO, have said the way that this may look, and I think this is a good visual, is client shows up to your BPO and says, I need 500 seats. And you do the analytics in terms of the call volume, the type of volume of what's coming in. And that call center might say, you know what, you don't need 500 seats, you need 250 seats, because we can basically get rid of 250 FTE call center agents, because we're going to do exactly what you're hearing Klarna do, which is automate it. And then that pricing model becomes different, that pricing model. And I'm hearing some chatter out there about the completed conversation. So if a customer comes into the platform, interacts with AI, with a bot, and the bot is able to handle that transaction to completion, they don't need to send it anywhere, then there's a charge, right? And so it's this way of kind of almost blending this human element of FTEs with this SaaS model of conversation or messaging that I think a lot of BPOs are really going to have to start to pull together to figure out what that looks like. But that brings up a different problem for them, which is AI is still horribly expensive. And I don't think a lot of people really understand that. Like when you get into the weeds, it's still pricey. Now it's coming down. Every time OpenAI releases a new version of Chatbot GPT, like 4.0 that's out there today, 3.5 is now cheaper, right? Because it's not as effective. So the running theory is that this next year, as we go into 2025, that prices will continue to drop on AI. It'll become more affordable for them to actually model that out in place. But I think that is the future of what the pricing model in the BPO will look like going forward.
Yeah. How do you see that, Steve? I mean, it sounds a lot like what we've already seen in traditional CX, but where the gig model has applied to it. Yeah. So you will agree that for each interaction, I'll pay $5 for a completed customer interaction rather than worrying about all of the costs that goes into a blended price.
Yeah, it's a great point. And the Klarna example is well worn. But there's another one recently. There was a great piece about changes happening in the Philippines, and they quoted the CEO of operations at Accenture, and he said that the contact center space is ripe for disruption. And he referenced one center operated by a client in the Middle East where AI is already deflecting 20% of call volumes from human beings. And then he says we could conceivably triple that in a year. And he estimates about 40% of all working hours across industries could be impacted by AI models and bots. So clients are very much scrambling to try to figure this out. He also said Gen AI, it's one of the fastest adoption rates of tech that he's ever seen and his company has ever seen. And so this is really interesting because we're getting testimony from the likes of Accenture, the likes of Klarna's CEO, the likes of the CEO of WNS said a quote a couple of weeks ago saying, anything, simple in the contact center, those human beings are gone. We're going to automate. We can do it already. The kind of grandiose statements. And then the question is, well, what is simple? So we're getting high up people telling us this, but it's also interesting, I find, reading some of the testimony from on the ground agents. Mm-hmm. And recently there have been pieces on both the Philippines and India, and in both cases, they've cited agents saying, well, my job is going to be gone soon. Now, are they choosing to quote those people because it's more fantastical to put get more clicks on the articles? Or are these people really seeing something at ground level that's happening, in addition to the higher ups that are making these prognostications? So I agree with Chris. Companies like Zendesk are starting to implement outcome-based models. A world of automation, that's the direction that everything seems to be headed in. Now, it hasn't been fully proven out yet, but Zendesk is kind of leading the charge, and there are a few others as well trying to implement this new pricing model into the system.
I think the BPOs out there, this would be my message, that are investing the time, energy, and effort to figure this out now are the ones that are going to be ahead. Because there's so many people that are going to be stuck in this model. They don't have the infrastructure, the resources to be able to implement it. So, and I think, you talk about, first mover, first market advantage. I really do think if, the BPOs that are really, really being aggressive and really that attitude of this space is ripe for disruption, which I think it is, they're the ones 2, 3, 4 years down the road, they're going to be much farther ahead than the ones that aren't adopting it now. Because I do think that this old BPO model is dead. We just don't know it yet, right? And it will, and you're going to see more and more of those changes coming over the next couple of years.
Do you think that that's also driven by a different kind of communication style? I mean, you only have to go back a few years, and the only time you'd ever interact with a brand is when you've got a problem. You need to reach out. Whereas now, I might post something on Nike's Instagram just to say I love these new shoes that they've just released, and at some point, someone's got to make a decision about, is that message something we need to respond to, or is it just we don't need to do anything? So you're kind of creating the need for relationship or community management as well.
I talk about competing priorities. AI is just one. You have so many other things that are happening. You have, and if I just keep it into the United States, right? You have this massively aging population that's happening. You have a horribly low birth rate over the last 15 years here. So you think about baby boomers are exiting the consumer market. My generation, Gen X, is kind of coming up to replace the baby boomer. And then you have this huge Gen Z, Gen Alpha demographic that is just turning everything we know upside down, right? I mean, they're really changing consumerism as we know it. And one of the things, Mark, you just mentioned was the rise of the influencer economy. And I don't think you can overlook that when you're thinking about CX and customer experience and what that means going forward, because this generation that's coming up is going to do things so much differently than what we've been used to with boomers and Gen X and even millennials to a certain extent, because the later stage millennials were more of a byproduct of Gen X, which is a byproduct of the baby boomer generation. So they have to take into account all of those things. And I think traditional CX models, as we think about connecting with the customer today, are being eroded. I talked with someone the other day, and it kind of goes back to job loss. And I agree that everybody expected all these jobs to be lost. It doesn't appear that that's happening yet, but I will say it is having a massive impact on some industries like marketing, like recruitment. I mean, I'm talking to recruitment agencies that are saying, I don't know if we're going to make it because now everybody's using all these AI automated tools to go do recruitment and headhunting, and same thing with marketing. I've talked to somebody the other day that said, I'm really worried about my business because more and more companies are using the Canvas of the world and AI-driven, marketing tools to do that. So, all of these things, these just competing priorities are really, like I said, putting downward pressure on brands. So it's not just the AI component that they have to think about. They have to think about all of these other things that are happening at the same time.
Yeah, and I would add to that point, Mark, about how people are going to be interacting differently. We wander back into the world of immersive interactions and how that will continue to develop over time. The dreaded metaverse term, spatial computing, whatever we want to call it, a time when younger people are going to be wandering into immersive spaces and maybe interacting with bots, and how will that develop as an opportunity set for careers and jobs and revenues and everything else, and nobody really knows.
All right, so maybe just let's throw out a couple of a final thought from each of you then. I mean, apart from going out and buying a copy of the Widening Turn book on Amazon, what would you say, Steve, as we sort of go into next year? I mean, what's maybe one of the I suppose the most concerning, or one of the principal areas where we're seeing or where CX executives should really be paying attention right now?
Well, I would come back to my first initial point about the development of the infrastructure and Chris, the use of the metaphor of the railroads being built. I mean, there's we haven't talked about all the projects or the potential planning that's going into mega AI data centers or supercomputers or AI chip clusters. States in the US like North Dakota and Texas and Oklahoma are already meeting with big tech firms that want to spend as much as $125 or $150 billion, for an example, to build out these mega clusters. And so I guess I would urge everyone to think about how the future is playing out in real time. All we have to do is kind of look out the window at the present to see how surreal things are. We don't have to prognosticate about the future. We're living it. And so that would be my biggest point, is keep an eye on the continued build out of the infrastructure and what that might mean.
Perfect.
Yeah,
okay,
mine would be, I actually have a copy of The Widening Turn. I would highly recommend people to go get it. And I would say that simply because right now, everybody, every business, consumer, I don't care who you are, we need to be educating ourselves on what AI is and what AI isn't, because we're all learning this at the same time. I say, I always say there really are no AI experts. There are people like Stephen and myself and others who are spending their incredible amount of time researching and analyzing and doing that. But we're all in this together. And my advice to any BPO out there right now would be, if you're not investing time and resources into understanding, strategizing, and coming up with a plan of how you're going to redo your model, engage outside companies, vendors, influencers, resources, bring all of that in and develop your roadmap, you will be left behind. I mean, there's just no two ways about that. So I always get concerned when I see companies they just say, we're too busy to be investing and looking at this. And, one of the things I'll point out, Mark, in 2024 already, there's already been more restaurant and retail bankruptcies halfway through this year than there were over the previous 3 years. And so if that doesn't tell you that the very nature, the foundation of consumerism is changing, you better figure it out, because you're seeing brands that have been around for 100 years going out of business because they've lost touch with the consumer. And they've lost touch with, how do I need to evolve and do my business? So that would be my plea, my humble plea for all those BPOs is make sure you're investing the time, energy. Don't be afraid to ask for outside help, and really develop your roadmap so that you don't get left behind.
All right, great. I mean, some fantastic insight there. So thanks very much to both of you.
Thanks for having us, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.